Let me get my screen up. All right, can you guys see that okay? Awesome.
All right, Veronica, whenever you're ready, you do have to end around 2:28, and make sure you have enough time for judge deliberations as well, and comments and feedback, but start whenever you're ready.
Awesome. All right, so hi guys, as Veronica said, I'm also Veronica, and my pitch idea is UpLeft. Pick up leftovers, uplift those in need. According to statistics in the from Food Waste America, the second highest proportion of food waste is actually from restaurants, with nearly 40% being dedicated to it. Also, in West Lafayette alone, 38.5% of the population, which accounts for 19,634 people, live in poverty. So looking at both of these two problems, the overabundance of food waste in restaurants, as well as the lack thereof in our own local community, I identified two potential target markets for further research. So first being restaurants, and second being homeless shelters and food pantries. And the idea for UpLeft, basically, it'd be a pickup service that would pick up leftovers at the end of closing shift from restaurants and deliver them to homeless shelters and food pantries for redistribution. So to validate the first target market, which was restaurants, I conducted 7 in-person interviews in the Chauncey area at Purdue University. And I went in with the hypothesis that restaurants would prefer donating already prepared food to homeless shelters and food pantries at the end of closing shift. To conduct the research, I came up with 5 questions, mainly considering the insights they had about food waste, as well as potential problems and solutions they have addressed. And the main concern I wanted to address here was even possible for the food to be donated? And if so, what food in specific or in particular could be donated? So I composed a list of restaurants that you can see there on the left. And in the following slides, I'll go into more depth on a few with the interview process I went through. So to kind of organize and analyze my findings, I used the business model canvas and particularly focused on the value propositions as well as customer segments. So looking into Mush, which was the first restaurant I interviewed, I talked to MJ, who was the front of house lead server, and she gave me the potential finding that instead of looking at already prepared food, a lot of times, especially like since Mush is in the pizza industry, they are more likely to give away uncooked food or ingredients, as well as a lot of times they will often throw out things that are past expiration dates. So looking from this customer segment into the value we could offer as a business, we could pick up more of ingredients versus already prepared food, as well as food that would have otherwise been thrown out past their expiration date. Next, I spoke to Greyhouse, and they gave me kind of an opposite finding. Since Greyhouse is more of a coffee shop, they have a lot of extra donuts. So instead of having ingredients, a lot of times they do have already prepared food ready. And most of that is unfortunately thrown away. And so looking at the value that we could bring as a business, we would be able to pick up donuts, as well as the additional insight, as opposed to kind of similar to Mush actually with the expiration dates. Greyhouse gave a more confined deadline of a week where most of their ingredients would be expired afterwards. So looking into maybe picking up the food at the end of closing shift, it might not be necessary to go every single day. And this gave me kind of a pivoting angle where it would be more valuable for both us and for restaurants to have something on a more weekly basis. Next, I talked to Chipotle, and they actually had, I actually had a really insightful interview with Noelle, who was the apprentice and assistant manager there. She said a lot of times that they would throw out rice, fajitas, steak, as well as expired food at the end of closing shift. And this could account to $30 to $40 worth of waste. And although that doesn't seem like a whole lot, this can add up to quite a bit if you look at it on a week and monthly standpoint. I think for a month, it could add up to a little over $1,000, and then a whole year even close to $12,000 to $15,000 which is not so little after all. And so looking at the value that we could bring, we'd be able to pick up this rice, fajitas, steak, and expired food past their expiration or before their expiration date and deliver them to areas of need. And one key aha moment I had during this interview is that Noelle even said, we've coordinated with LUM, which stands for the Lafayette Urban Ministry, and Food Finders, but they didn't show up. So it's not like businesses haven't tried giving extra food to homeless shelters and food pantries. It just seems more of a lack of coordination or communication between the two, which UpLeft would be able to offer. And lastly, I spoke with XXX. I spoke with the daughter of the owner there, actually. Her name was Samantha, and she gave just more insights into kind of the customer pains that she was experiencing as a restaurant. A lot of times she said, I think one of her direct quotes was here on the slide. It says, "I wish my parents and I could give it away." And she even went on to say that it's just weird that this is a problem that still exists with having an overabundance of food and people still going away hungry every night. And it seems like the restaurant industry in particular would be able to help people give them food, especially in the Purdue community when a lot of students are food insecure, and in the West Lafayette and Lafayette locations as well. So after addressing kind of the target need for restaurants, I went ahead and looked at the homeless shelters and food pantries as well to make sure that this is a service that they would be able to utilize as well. And so I conducted 2 phone interviews, going in with the hypothesis that homeless shelters and food pantries prefer receiving already prepared food donations and at the earliest convenience. I again went ahead and composed and asked 6 of the following questions, which you can see pictured here, but they mainly concerned insights, problem solutions, being able to accept the food, types of food, as well as hours of operation from their end. And I spoke with LTHC, which stands for Lafayette Transitional Housing Center, and St. James Food Pantry. So speaking with LTHC, I did discover that they were able to take food donations, but not only food donations, but also they take ingredients and hot and already prepared food. And this is great to hear because it kind of validated that if we're looking to give away food, yes, homeless shelters are able to accept it, and they even accept ingredients as well as already prepared food. Also, speaking with St. James Food Pantry, unfortunately, from that interview, I was able to see that they were able to accept ingredients, but not necessarily already prepared food. So that kind of changed my way of thinking about things, but still was a very useful and insightful information I gained from it. So to kind of conclude with final hypotheses, validations, and as well as conclusions, I started off with the restaurants hypothesis that restaurants prefer donating already prepared food to homeless shelters and food pantries at the end of closing shift. Whereas with homeless shelters and food pantries, I hypothesized that homeless shelters and food pantries prefer receiving already prepared food donations and at the earliest convenience. So through this process, I was able to address that there is a target market need there's a need in both target markets. But I was had to pivot a little bit on the best way to do that. And that mainly concerned the type of food versus already prepared versus ingredients, as well as where it would be going to. So with the final conclusions I made, it'd be most beneficial from both standpoints for on a daily basis to drop off already made food or pick it up from restaurants and then drop it off to homeless shelters. And then on a weekly basis, pick up ingredients and non-perishables from restaurants and deliver that to food pantries. So looking into next steps, I wanted to address that this is mainly just target market validation, and I was able to do such from a marketing standpoint. But looking forward to the future, I'm looking into ways to finance this business and mainly concerned with nonprofits donations. And I'm specifically looking into how to get this maybe on a tax write-off standpoint with corporate responsibility. Again, I want to research more into upper management for chain restaurants. I know local restaurants don't have a lot of the corporate management kind of preventing them from doing something like this, but with chain restaurants, I'll need to talk to more people in general, as well as food safety, temperature regulation, and food storage, and looking at a national scope what other companies are doing. Lastly, with expansion, looking into a partnership with DoorDash and Grubhub, since those are already existing businesses, looking into home and grocery waste, as well as possibly a brick and mortar as well. Thank you so much.
All right. Nice job, Veronica. I love the concept. Definite need, right?
Mhm.
Like you got to move stuff from here to the people who need it.
Yeah.
So I'm interested in, so one of your customer bases there involved with the restaurants.
Mhm.
And I like how you kind of segregated, like homeless shelters could take more of the fresh foods, already prepared, whereas the food pantry are more ingredients based. Okay.
Yeah.
And I think I can understand where the food pantry would be hesitant to take fresh foods or already prepared food, right? Because the clock's ticking.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, is that their kind of main concern was like, if I take already cooked fajitas,
Mhm.
right? I've got so much time and I'm a food pantry. Is
Yeah.
that where their concern was?
Yeah. When I spoke with them, their main concern was food storage. A lot of times, like it depended if they had the refrigeration necessary.
Mhm.
And also it was a timing thing too, being able to, based on their hours of operation, hand it out within a time that it wouldn't, expire on their hands.
Okay. So my next question to kind of follow up on that is, what are the options for those customer bases, your restaurants that are more apt to have like fresh foods, prepared foods? Could you incorporate something into that channel where it is freezing that? Because if you could get 20 fajitas from Chipotle or whatever, but you could freeze those, and then they could the food pantries take frozen foods, or is that out of their wheelhouse?
I would assume it would be within reason. I'd probably have to do more research, but just hearing that, I think, because obviously like frozen food lasts longer. So if we're able to freeze it and give it away,
Yeah.
it should have a good or better shelf life.
Yeah, I just think, because that's going to be like one of your main partners there is going to be those food banks.
Yeah.
And if that is the crux of why they can't, right? Because clock's ticking, I got 48 hours to distribute this, or we have to refrigerate it. Is there some way you could partner with those restaurants to offer them freezer, I don't know, like freezer
like freezer
bags, or
yeah.
so they could here at the end of the night, we put it all into these Ziploc freezer bags, or what, something that would be regular, I'm sure from the health department side has to be very, processed in a certain way. But if you could work with those customers to freeze it versus trying to take fresh, I think that changes your paradigm of then what you're dealing with.
Yeah, no, that would help a lot with, especially just like the timing of everything too.
Yeah.
And I know when I was doing research, I took a business writing class here at Purdue, and I was looking into like the whole refrigeration, food safety process of it. And I really like the idea of frozen, because I was mainly going for like refrigeration. Like if we could provide like refrigeration for food pantries, if they didn't have it, then that would be, at least they could be able to receive it that way. But if it's frozen, then it kind of, extends that a lot.
Yeah. All right. So just dig into what is the biggest pain point for those food banks in taking fresh food, and what other alternative solutions can you give them as opposed to the fresh food? Like freeze it. I don't know. You have a mobile flash, freezing service or something.
Yeah.
Okay.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you. That's a really good insight.
I can barrel away next. Thanks for the presentation and the interviews that you discussed. I have a couple questions on the restaurants, and then maybe more general questions. The first thing that occurred to me, so this is actually this general space of like food waste, and is actually a space that I had talked to a couple of other friends who had looked into starting companies here before, about one from the angle of like you sort of picking up food waste and talking to restaurants, and the fact that restaurants have generate a lot of food waste was familiar to me from their experience there. Another perspective that another founder friend took before was reducing food waste at the front end. So helping
Okay.
restaurants generate less food waste by ordering the right amount of food and things like that versus having to deal with food waste at the end of the pipeline.
Yeah.
So from that perspective, I guess one question to ask is, what is the current like food waste problem costing these restaurants? And like, what are their current solutions for dealing with it costing them? Like, are they just worried about the cost of the food that they're not using, or do they have to spend money to throw them away?
Yeah.
If they were having them picked up, would that cost them additional like personnel costs? Do you have a rough idea of like what the cost structures are for them for different kinds of solutions?
I do not personally, but I do remember from interviews saying, especially from a prevention standpoint, that a lot of times they do, or like they're really good at taking those preventative measures. They said that they have the kind of like, I forget the word for it exactly, but the sales per day to kind of, predict what they'll have at each day. So they're able to prep the right amount of food. So I do remember that, but I'm not sure on specific costs in general. And I do like what you said with like the whole, where are their costs coming from? Is it from, like the trash, like having to take it out, or is it from just loss of goods in general?
Right. I liked that when your Chipotle interview, you got a specific number or number range of like $34 a day, X $1,000 a month. It would have been interesting to see how that figure compares to other restaurants, and also how it compares to their like other daily costs of doing business. Because if it costs them $1,000 a month, but like hiring an extra person costs them $10,000 a month or something, then the food waste cost might not be the biggest thing, right? Did you find any differences? I know you sort of touched on this at the end, but did you find any differences between chain restaurants like Chipotle and Panda Express versus other restaurants and how they think about food waste?
It was, I don't know if I could specifically peg point it, but I do remember Chipotle saying with their food waste, like from a corporate standpoint, they are very focused on sustainability. So they are more willing to, donate or give to local areas of need. But when I did speak with Panda, a lot of times, or I spoke with the manager, and they said, I don't know, like it's up to corporate and they probably aren't going to be able to like do much because, it's out of my hands kind of vibe. So that's why with like next steps, that's like one of my main focuses and concerns is speaking with corporate, trying to, get more into what can we do on an overhead to kind of filter that down into each of the individual branches.
Right. I almost wonder if I think one of the last things you said around speaking more to upper management, to people who have higher level roles at the restaurants, and for around CSR, I think that's a good idea. There's also potentially a world, I think, where like rather than focusing on food waste, which is logistically really, really difficult to handle, maybe there's another universe where restaurants in their like bulk purchases of food, they buy an additional X%, and then it goes to homeless shelters or food pantries or something like that, and it becomes a CSR thing without you guys having to actually handle like sort of the food where the clock is ticking. So I think that's a really interesting direction. Last couple of questions I had was, have you given any thought to how different restaurants in suburban areas like Lafayette versus like bigger urban areas like Indianapolis, where there's maybe more money going around and more food being ordered? I'm curious. Yeah, I guess, have you thought about potential differences there as markets?
Yes, I have thought about it, but I have yet to do extensive research on it. I know I was mainly focused on local area here because, just being at Purdue, it was easier to kind of, pinpoint it here where there's area of need. But I have heard of just, in general, of other people kind of trying to do similar things, but I haven't had the time yet to do all the research needed for it.
Got it. My last question is, or less of a question, more of just kind of an interesting potential other space to look at might be, if you've talked to, I think especially with a lot of the logistically difficult things around how to store food, regulations, things like that, other folks who are already doing this kind of work, like food finders,
Mhm.
have a lot of knowledge about it. And I wonder if a potential way to make a difference in this area might be, rather than sort of competing with them in a way, talking to them about what their problems are. And if you can make them
Yes.
twice as efficient, that's another
Yes.
different way to make a difference, right? And so have you talked to them at all, or is that talking to those types of people something you
They
thought about?
were they were definitely ones that I tried reaching out to. They just never got back to me, but I did end up sending an email and I'm waiting to hear back. But yes, I'm totally with you with the whole partnering up to, tackle this problem. I don't want to like compete, compete, but in a way that's, beneficial to the cause.
Right. Cool. Yeah, it's definitely a space worth having more eyes on. So thanks for doing the research and thanks for the presentation.
Yes, thank you.
Hey Veronica, I'm Arpan.
Hi.
Firstly, great presentation and kudos for solving a problem that can help improve lives. So kudos for that. I guess like a couple of points. I know most of it is already covered, but just a couple of points from my side. So I think one thing you mentioned was that 40% of all food waste comes from restaurants.
Mhm.
I think just like when you give presentations, it would be great if you can give like color into what that 40% really means, like in terms of
Okay.
kg, or in terms of like how many people does that feed. Like I can
Gotcha. Okay.
imagine that it's a huge number, but like if you just give that, that color to your statement, I think it makes it a lot more impactful.
Yes. Okay.
The other thing was like you mentioned, so you had like 7 food chains, right, on that, and most of them were like food chains and not like
Mhm.
mom and pop shops. So if you maybe interviewed more mom and pop shops, you might get like another dimension to your thesis, because these food chains are very, I guess, like efficient in the way they do work. Like
Mhm.
they know how much food to make every single day because they have data and things like that,
Yeah.
whereas mom and pop shop might not. So it might just add like another dimension to what you're trying to build. So that might be interesting to kind of see. The other thing was like, have you thought about like what times these restaurants are closing? Because you had Mad Mush, which I think, if I'm not wrong, closes at 3 a.m. At least when I was at Purdue, I think, right? Versus some of the other ones close a lot earlier. So picking up food from them might be a logistical issue.
Yeah.
Um, Also, like, I guess a question for you, like, are you planning to deliver this food the same night, or is it food for next morning, like in terms of like their breakfast, their lunch?
The plan would be to do it at night because that's when the restaurants would be closing, and I feel like they'd be more able to or willing to have someone come in and pick it up right then and there to make it easier for the restaurant standpoint. But then hearing from like a pickup standpoint from food pantries and homeless shelters, a lot of times they don't open until the following day. And so going back to the whole like refrigeration or freezing, almost like being able to provide like a middle kind of area where drivers would be able to pick up and then deliver to a fridge or like freezer almost, and have that ready for the food pantry and homeless shelter the next day is kind of the idea. But that's definitely something I've taken into consideration, just kind of like logistics behind, opening and closing and when would be best for everyone.
Yeah, so there are a couple of things to think about, right? Like if you add refrigeration into your entire supply chain, like then you have to
Yeah.
add a warehouse, and then you have to have like a pickup drop there, and then another person picking it up from there. So
Yeah.
that adds complexity. And then if you're doing it late at night, most people might have eaten food already. If like the restaurants are giving you food at 11, and then these things get delivered to the homeless shelter at like 12 or 1 a.m. So something to think about on how you can, maybe kind of tweak that process.
Yeah.
That's why like most companies have their pitfall when they try to solve this problem. And then the other thing was, have you thought about like how much % of food, like let's say per zip code, will you be able to collect to be able to like deliver to the homeless shelter? And why I ask this question is because like if you're doing it on a daily basis, you kind of have to figure that number out, so that
Yeah.
whether the homeless shelter is not making food for them, or they're already getting food, because you don't want food wasted in the homeless shelter as well, right?
Yeah. Exactly.
So that since you're like trying to solve, for less food wastage in the entire supply chain, so try to figure out like how much food can you get from like one zip code, or like from, let's say, from 10 restaurants, or like how many people can they feed on weekdays and then on weekends? Like, let's do separate thesis, and then that can also like add to another point in your thesis. Yeah, I think that's it from my end. I think yeah, you did a great job of presenting, and good luck.
Awesome. Thank you all so much.
We are going to wrap up in 1 minute if there's any last comments, and then give the judges 2 minutes to write down stuff and prepare for the next group.
Yeah, I guess I had a quick question. Like, how did you get started in this space? Like, what was the initial motivation?
The initial motivation, I actually worked in the restaurant industry. So I worked at Chipotle, and I was the one like throwing out like the rice and the fajitas at the end of the day. And so I was like, it's just like guilt, just like throwing it all away, knowing that like other people could have it. That was definitely the start of everything.
Yeah.
You should add that to your story. Maybe.
Yeah.
All right, great job, UpLeft. Thank you, Veronica.
Thank you.
Quasi, you're next. We're going to start you at 2:30.